Hey guys, tonight we drift across a landscape of endless sand, where stars prickle against velvet skies and dunes ripple like ocean waves frozen in gold. You imagine your sandals sinking into fine grains, the hush of desert wind brushing your ears. There's no Wi-Fi out here, no GPS, just a horizon that mocks your sense of direction. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this trek without someone yelling, "Hydrate, dude!" every 10 steps. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a quick comment telling me your location and the local time right now. It's oddly soothing to see our little campfire of listeners scattered across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward into the Sahara, not the postcard desert of a quick camel ride from Marrakesh, but the deep Sahara, the one where mirages play pranks and the silence makes your ears ring. Beneath your feet, the dunes conceal forgotten ledgers, ruined walls, and cities swallowed by time. You stumble into a half-buried archway, stone still warm from the sun. The place looks like an accidental library left open to the desert. Ledgers tucked into niches like offerings. One mainstream fact you pick up: the Sahara wasn't always an empty desert. Thousands of years ago, it was greener, dotted with lakes and towns. People thrived here, trading, building, and, because no human society can resist, collecting taxes. What's surprising is the paperwork left behind. Imagine trekking across the desert for weeks only to find that your ancestors weren't just carving out a living, they were carving out receipts. Sand crunches under your steps as you wander past walls etched with inscriptions. Some detail shipments of salt, others tally livestock. You brush dust off a fragment and laugh under your breath. It's basically a tax form from 1,500 years ago. The kind of thing that would bore you to sleep in any modern office. Yet here, in flickering torchlight, it feels like treasure. The quirky tidbit you discover is that some tax records weren't written on parchment or papyrus, but actually carved into stone and clay, as if the officials didn't trust the future desert not to shred their paperwork. It's bureaucracy hardened like fossils. Imagine the meeting where someone proposed that, "Let's make the receipts last longer than the empire itself." They succeeded, because you're standing here centuries later squinting at their handwriting. Historians still argue whether these inscriptions were daily admin notes or ceremonial records meant to prove a ruler's control. Was the king really micromanaging camel tolls, or was he just flexing his authority in stone? Either way, you feel the faint echo of clerks hunched over, tongue sticking out in concentration, trying to make sure no donkey tax went uncounted. You shuffle deeper through the ruins. There's an odd comfort in the repetition. Lines of numbers, symbols for grain, tallies of goats. The boredom is almost soothing, like background white noise for the anxious mind. You picture a dusty scribe muttering, "Another goat, another line, another day closer to retirement." It's not glamorous, but it's familiar. Bureaucracy ages like fine wine, frustrating in every century. You find yourself tracing grooves with your fingertips, imagining hands that carved them centuries ago. The desert swallowed their voices, but it left their paperwork intact. You smirk. If aliens ever find Earth, maybe they won't marvel at our art or skyscrapers, but at our tax codes. Beautifully dull and meticulously complete. And maybe they'll nap halfway through reading them, just like you're starting to. You shuffle past the ruined archway, sand spilling like water around your ankles, and suddenly the air thickens with a phantom hum. It's not real, but your imagination fills the silence with the chatter of an oasis market. You blink and almost see it. Stalls shaded by patched cloth, wooden tables sagging with bundles of dates, pottery, and baskets of grain. Donkeys bray impatiently as traders bicker over prices. Voices rising in waves of irritation that sound suspiciously like any modern checkout line. Here in this once bustling hub, merchants trade more than food. They argue over blocks of salt, massive white slabs that shimmer faintly like treasure chests. You watch as a sweating trader slams a slab onto the ground, sending a puff of dust into the air. "Worth 2 goats!" he shouts. His rival shakes his head, insists it's 1 goat and a chicken. Somewhere on the sidelines, an official waits with a clay tablet, ready to carve the deal into permanence. Salt is currency, but taxes, of course, must be paid on it. You suppress a laugh. Bureaucracy never misses payday, even in the desert. One mainstream fact keeps buzzing in your head. West African trade routes made salt as valuable as gold. Towns like Tahaza and Timbuktu built their wealth on slabs hauled across the dunes. And unlike shiny coins, salt was essential. You needed it to live, especially in a place where sweat fell faster than rain. Still, imagine explaining to your neighbor today that you've been taxed on seasoning. A quirky tidbit tickles your brain. Some records mention salt taxes not just in blocks, but in crumbs. That's right. There was apparently paperwork for broken shards too small for trade. Picture a tax collector bent over, weighing fragments like a jeweler, sighing heavily as he scribbles, "half crumb, taxable." You almost want to pat him on the back and whisper, "Buddy, maybe just let that one go." Historians still argue whether those clay receipts were everyday logs or ceremonial tallies to impress rulers far away. Were scribes actually counting every salt chunk in real time? Or were they just making up neat lists after market day to keep their bosses happy? You lean against a crumbled wall and smirk. Honestly, you'd probably do the same. Make up numbers and hope no one noticed. The market feels alive around you, though you know it's only memory and imagination. You catch the scent of grilled fish drifting from a corner stall. A trader waves a date cluster under your nose, sticky and sweet. Behind him, a scribe scratches furiously, his stylus clinking against clay as he notes down who bought what, and what cut the officials demanded. His expression is the same one you've seen on modern accountants. Slightly weary, slightly smug, resigned to knowing exactly how much everyone owes. The rhythm of haggling, carving, and stamping becomes hypnotic. You notice how similar it all feels to scrolling receipts in a shopping app. Replace camels with delivery trucks, replace salt slabs with smartphones, and the system looks oddly familiar. Humans have always traded, argued, and cursed at taxes. A moment of humor slips through when you imagine a tax officer chasing after a merchant with a broken salt block. "Sir, that's taxable. Please return with the proper paperwork." The merchant sighs, kicks sand over the shard, and pretends it never existed. The voices around you fade as the market melts back into silence, leaving only ruined walls and drifting sand. The clay receipts are scattered like forgotten post-it notes across centuries. You crouch and pick up a shard, the faint imprint of a number still visible. It's both ridiculous and strangely comforting, proof that even here, in the emptiest desert, people once worried about the same boring things that still keep us up at night. You step out of the ghostly market and stumble into the shade of a crumbling tower, its stones sun-bleached and stubbornly clinging together. Inside, the coolness smells faintly of dust and old ink. Here the chatter isn't about merchants, but monarchs. Imagine desert kings perched on carved stools, cloaks draped dramatically, sandals polished just enough to impress, their brows furrowed. Not over war or conquest, but over the absolute necessity of counting beans. The Garamantes, a people tucked deep into what's now Libya, were among those rulers. They thrived in underground irrigation systems called foggeras, channeling water through tunnels that stretched for miles. And because no good thing goes untaxed, the kings of this desert made sure every bushel of grain, every goat bleat, every caravan passing by, found its way into a neat column of numbers. You picture a royal official standing stiffly before his ruler, sweat dripping down his back, reciting 7 donkeys, 4 baskets of millet, 1 suspiciously overweight goat. The mainstream fact is clear. The Garamantes ran a surprisingly advanced kingdom between 500 BCE and 500 CE. They grew crops in a desert where most people would keel over within an hour, and their power depended on taxing this ingenuity. Imagine the royal ledgers, half survival plan, half revenue stream. But here comes the quirky tidbit. One fragmentary record suggests fees for, of all things, goat droppings. Not the goats themselves, not the milk or hides, just the droppings, perhaps valued as fertilizer. You stifle a laugh at the mental image of a scribe carefully counting lumps. Majesty, today we collected 43 any contributions. If that doesn't prove bureaucratic creativity, nothing does. Historians still argue whether the Garamantes were truly centralized tax fanatics, or if their bean counting was more localized, run by community elders rather than the king's accountants. Some argue for a rigid system with royal oversight, others for a looser arrangement where villages just handed over enough and scribes filled in the rest. You lean back against the stone, amused by the idea that even back then, nobody could agree on how taxes actually worked. Through the cool chamber, you hear the echo of styluses scratching papyrus. You imagine a royal accountant, thin as a reed, whispering numbers into the ear of a guard who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. The king, meanwhile, nods sagely, pretending to follow every figure but probably zoning out halfway through, just as you do when someone explains tax brackets today. Outside, you picture caravans arriving, camels laden with salt, grain, or perhaps exotic goods from sub-Saharan Africa. Each stop at the city gate means another round of fees. Some caravan leader grumbles, rolling his eyes so hard you can almost hear it. And yet he pays because the king's men are less forgiving than bandits. At least the bandits don't make you sign receipts. The rhythm of taxation becomes oddly soothing. Columns of numbers, repeated symbols, tick marks that look like tallying chickens. You can almost hear the bored mutter of scribes. 3 sacks millet, 1 goat, 1 pair sandals with questionable resale value. It's monotonous, but the monotony has its own strange comfort, like counting sheep. Or in this case, counting sheep that have been appropriately taxed. Humor bubbles up when you imagine an accountant desperately trying to explain goat-dropping tax to a confused villager. No, you don't owe for the goat today, just for what the goat left behind. Yes, really, it's law. You chuckle softly to yourself, half impressed by the ingenuity, half horrified. The tower is silent now, the rulers long gone, their bean counts lost in sand. But their obsession with order lingers, carved into fragments, whispering through time. And here you are, eyes heavy, lulled not by songs or stories of conquest, but by the droning comfort of old numbers lined neatly across forgotten scrolls. You drift from the cool tower into the hush beneath palm fronds, where shade pools in scalloped crescents, and the heat finally loosens its grip. Here, under a net of leaf shadow, a low table waits like a tiny courthouse. You kneel beside it, elbows brushing woven mats, and watch a scribe trim his reed pen with a sliver of bone. The cut is careful, ceremonial almost, the way a barista fusses over grind size. One bad angle and the ink either gushes or sulks. He tests the nib across his thumbnail, then taps a small jar. Soot mixed with gum arabic and a few drops of water, glossy as midnight. When he stirs, a bit of wind blows grit into the pot. He doesn't even flinch, just sighs the sigh of every desk worker ever, and murmurs, "Nature's glitter." Joke 1. The desert is clearly not ISO certified for clean rooms. Lines bloom on papyrus, fibers running like wood grain beneath the script. You catch the rhythm, a column for names, a column for baskets of dates, a column for deductions that could make a modern accountant blush with professional respect. One mainstream fact steadies the scene. In oases across the Sahara's fringes, think Egypt's Dakhla and Karga, the Fezzan in Libya, papyri and ostraca, pottery shards, survive that detailed taxes and deliveries, the day-to-day arithmetic of life in places most maps treat like blankness. You remember hearing about the Kelly's papyri from the Dakhla oasis. Receipts, rosters, notes that prove people here weren't just surviving, they were filing. You watch as today's harvest shuffles forward. A farmer sets down a palm fiber basket brimming with dates the color of burned sugar. The scribe counts aloud. 9 baskets, then a half basket for the undersized fruit, which will likely become syrup. His reed skates, and there it is, the rate. 1 in 10 to the storehouses. Is this tithe? Zakat? Local custom with a familiar ring? Historians still argue whether the 1 in 10 recorded in oases like these represents a classical tithe legacy, an Islamic-era tax standard adapted for desert realities, or a purely regional habit that just happens to land on a round, pleasing number. You nod at the neatness of it. When food is measured in baskets, Bausten suddenly feels like destiny. But the fun is in the margins. You notice a tiny notation. Feed for pack animals deducted at a fixed allowance per day, plus an extra crumb for hobbles and hoof care. You grin. Donkey wear and tear, itemized. The scribe's pen stalls while he calculates how many desert miles equal a new set of sandals for the beast. Is this real policy or creative accounting? That's where the sands shift. Historians still argue whether such maintenance deductions were codified rules or clever fictions, traders deployed until some sleepy official, lulled by arithmetic, waved them through. Either way, the scribe has a face that says, "I know what you're doing, and I respect the effort." You ask about ink, and he obliges with pride. Soot for black, iron-rich earth for brown, crushed red for warnings, and overdue marks. The quirky tidbit he drops casually makes you snort. On scorching days, they sometimes draft on wax tablets to practice totals, only to watch the lines droop by noon as if the numbers themselves were too drowsy to stand up. Call it the original soft delete. Joke 2. Somewhere a manager insisted heat-proof tablets by Q3, and the sun laughed. A palm fiber fan creaks in a clerk's hand, stirring air that smells of dates, dust, and the faint sweetness of gum arabic. The queue of farmers hums with the tired optimism of people who've brought something tangible. Baskets that clack, rope that scratches across calloused palms, receipts that flutter like tame moths. You catch yourself timing your breath to the scribe's pen strokes. Inhale on a name, exhale on a number, until your shoulders settle and the world narrows to a gentle metronome of counting. Another mainstream fact threads in. The date palm is the backbone of these settlements. Food, shade, rope, wine if you're discreet, and timber for beams that rarely meet a forest. In Islamic jurisprudence you've heard cited in Sahelian towns, dates join grain and livestock in the family of taxed staples, with rates depending on irrigation and yield. The scribe's codes echo that world, but they also carry fingerprints from older regimes. Roman levies that once touched the deep desert, Byzantine rules clinging in monasteries, and Berber customs that prefer agreements sealed with a handshake under a tree. Historians still argue whether the paperwork you're peeking at is the descendant of imperial decrees or the fossil of local bargains polished into law by repetition. He flips a page and you spot a red line. Late delivery. The penalty? An extra measure taken in kind at next market day, plus a small fee to the scribe for copying. You give him a look. He pretends not to notice, then hides a smile. Bureaucracies everywhere learn to bill for their ink, and because the desert is a specialist in breakage, there's a section about loss in transit. Sandstorms, predation by tooth, you assume this means camel stole the snack, and acts of wind that read like a legal shrug. A note clarifies that if your pack animal eats part of the taxable load, you still owe, unless witnesses can attest to the theft. You picture a camel lined up to testify, chewing cud like a lawyer. Joke 3. The camel refuses to swear on a reed pen without counsel present. A familiar memory nips your heel, that goat-dropping fee from earlier. Here, fertilizer gets a friendlier name, field nourishment, and sometimes earns a credit if delivered to communal gardens. You chuckle at the thought that somewhere, sometime, a farmer proudly wheeled in a truly heroic contribution and demanded a receipt. The scribe, unflappable, probably had a special stamp for that. You glance back at the waiting line. A widow with a small basket, a caravaner with wrists roped by sunburn, a boy wearing a cord of date pits strung like beads. The scribe treats each the same, head tilted, reed whispering, the law bending incrementally where compassion fits in the cracks. Historians still argue whether clerks like him were salaried civil servants or minor entrepreneurs paid in fees and favors, early tax farmers who skimmed a tidy living off every mark. His posture suggests both, public purpose held delicately in one hand, survival in the other. The breeze picks up. Palm shadows flicker across the papyrus, and your mind follows the light across centuries. Later, farther south and west, scholars in Timbuktu will copy legal opinions onto imported paper, edges dusted with sand, discussing zakat on caravans, debts, and dates, while poetry lounges in the next folio. Earlier, at the Saharan oases tied to the Nile, scribes will lean over papyrus from marsh plants harvested far away, proof that even paperwork travels. You feel the odd tenderness of that truth. Ink is its own caravan, ferrying rules from one horizon to another. A pair of inspectors wander by, counting aloud. You can tell they've memorized the cadence of fairness. Too strict and people hide their baskets. Too loose and the storehouses starve next season. They pause under a palm whose fronds clatter like coins, then nod at the scribe's ledger. The tree seems to approve. You're suddenly aware that the palms themselves are the best auditors. Slow, patient, impossible to bribe. Their shade doesn't change for flattery. The day softens. The scribe shakes out his hand, flexing fingers stiff from 1,000 tiny decisions. He rolls the papyrus with a practiced snap, ties it with a strand of palm fiber, and tucks it into a clay jar lined with scraps of cloth. Somewhere, a child laughs. Somewhere, a goat sneezes like a trumpet. The line shortens. Numbers settle into their columns. Sand settles back into silence. And the palms whisper on, rustle by rustle, as if reminding you that beneath all the arithmetic, this place is a garden taught to live inside a desert. You breathe with it, slow and even. You feel how rules like irrigation channels can guide the flow without strangling it entirely. If a deduction for donkey hobbles helps the caravan make it to next season, perhaps the ink has done a small kindness. And if a red line scolds a late basket but the scribe quietly halves the penalty because the well went brackish last month, well, maybe the ledger learns mercy in the shade. You leave the oasis scribes behind, papyrus still rustling in your imagination, and step into a stretch of desert so white with glare it feels like walking through powdered glass. Ahead, a caravan groans into view, each camel sagging under what looks like stone coffins. But these aren't coffins. They're salt slabs, stacked like ancient refrigerators on legs that barely care. You fall into line, and soon the grumbling of traders fills the air. Everyone complains about the same thing. Not the sun, not the thirst, but the taxes. Salt isn't just seasoning here, it's literal money. Whole blocks, each about the size of your torso, are treated like oversized coins. One mainstream fact slides into your ear. In medieval West Africa, salt could be traded pound for pound with gold. Kings of Ghana and Mali didn't just eat it. They taxed it, guarded it, and built empires on its movement across the dunes. That explains the grim look on the caravan master's face as an official waves him down. At the checkpoint, a low stone platform squats like an accountant's altar. Inspectors circle, eyes sharp, chisels ready to scratch tallies into clay. One camel kneels unwillingly, its slab heaved off, measured, and stamped with a seal. A trader mutters, "This block shrank since Timbuktu." The inspector, without missing a beat, retorts, "Depreciation. Natural wear and tear." You smirk. The desert sun has apparently invented the concept of inflation before modern economists got the memo. The quirky tidbit makes you snort. Some ledgers record fractional salt taxes, where flakes and chips were swept up and counted as partial payments. Imagine arguing over dust. A trader pulls out a pouch, shakes it like pepper, and insists it covers a fee. Somewhere in the background, a scribe dutifully writes, "half handful, taxable." You can't decide if that's efficiency or madness. Historians still argue whether these salt tax records were strictly financial or partially ceremonial. Was every crumb tallied in real time, or were scribes dramatizing the process to remind everyone that the state watched even the smallest trade? The debate hangs in the hot air like mirage shimmer. Camels grunt. Inspectors tap salt with rods, listening for hollowness like bankers tapping coins for counterfeits. You picture a shady trader hollowing out a slab, stuffing it with sand, then sweating bullets at inspection. Humor sneaks in when you imagine the inspector breaking it open, sand spilling everywhere, and the trader blurting, "It's low sodium?" Joke one delivered. Further down the line, a woman argues fiercely, her slab cracked en route, and half-lies scattered in the sand. She swears it was thieves. The inspector shrugs, points at a rule carved into a clay tablet. Loss in transit still taxable unless verified by witnesses. You want to tell her it sounds suspiciously like modern insurance fine print. Some things never change. You lean against a salt block, cool despite the sun, and catch your reflection faintly shimmering on its crystalline face. The idea of entire kingdoms fueled by this heavy, brittle wealth is oddly comforting. Paper currency might crumble, digital numbers might vanish, but salt will still sit stubbornly in the sun. Of course, carrying your savings on camelback does make ATM withdrawals awkward. Later, as the caravan trudges on, you overhear scribes comparing the going rates. One laughs about a clause that once exempted holy cows from salt tax, though nobody remembers if it referred to actual cattle or sacred metaphors. The others tease him, saying he's been reading receipts too literally again. Joke 2. Imagine a cow walking free through customs, smugly mooing at the camels. By nightfall, fires flicker against the dunes. Traders gather, swapping tails while nibbling flakes of the very slabs they guard, careful not to make the inspectors suspicious. You hear someone whisper that in some ledgers, tax on salt included an extra taste allowance, as if governments even then couldn't resist sampling their own product. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine policy or a creative way for scribes to snack without guilt. You lay back against a block, stars spread like spilled salt overhead. The desert breathes in long, cool sighs. Around you, traders mumble, scribes tally. Inspectors debate the fairness of half-handfuls. It's a lullaby of bureaucracy, steady as a heartbeat, steady as a camel's plod. And here in the glow of salt fires, you feel yourself slipping into the rhythm, counting slabs, counting stars, counting the tiny absurdities that make history strangely human. The night dissolves into dawn, and with it the caravan stirs, a ragged procession of long legs, jingling bells, and bleary-eyed traders tugging turbans tight. You fall into step again, your feet leaving shallow crescents in the cool sand. It's not the camels that weigh heavy on your mind, but the paperwork. Every beast in this train, hundreds of them, isn't just a walking pantry. It's a tax liability on 4 knobbly knees. One mainstream fact stands out. Many Saharan trade networks operated with checkpoints where caravans were taxed per camel, not just per cargo. Towns like Sijil Masa and Adagust collected these levies religiously because caravans passing through could number in the thousands. Picture an inspector at the city gate yawning as he ticks off animals one by one. 1, 2, 3, 472. It's basically the desert version of counting parked cars in a stadium lot. And the quirky tidbit? In some surviving notes, scribes distinguished between ordinary camels and royal camels. Royal beasts apparently got discounted tolls as if they carried loyalty cards. You imagine a camel smugly strutting past the checkpoint while a merchant's donkey rolls its eyes. Joke 1. The royal camel probably demanded a velvet saddle, too. Historians still argue whether these per-head camel taxes were consistent across the desert or improvised by each city-state. Some claim standardization existed. Every camel 2 coins, no exceptions. While others suggest inspectors varied the fee depending on mood, weather, or whether they'd had their morning coffee substitute. Date wine, maybe. The truth likely shifts like dunes, but either way, the scribes never ran out of columns to fill. You pause beside one checkpoint ruin. A low wall remains, half buried, with fragments of ostraca, broken pottery shards covered in tiny numbers. Each shard once recorded a transaction. 3 camels, 4 baskets millet, paid. You pick one up, squint at the faded ink, and grin. It's essentially a parking stub from 1,000 years ago. The caravan master mutters at his animals. Inspectors stroll along the line carrying reeds like wands, tapping each camel's load, then jotting notes into clay or leather-bound registers. One even ties a small tag to a beast's halter, a primitive receipt fluttering in the wind. You nearly laugh out loud. It looks like medieval luggage tags, complete with scribbles only the clerks can decipher. A humor-laced scene unfolds as one inspector stops abruptly, points at a particularly lazy camel, and insists it's underreporting its cargo. The trader argues back. The beast ate half the load, it's lighter now. The inspector isn't amused, scribbles a penalty for loss by negligence. Joke 2 writes itself. Imagine modern customs fining you because your suitcase snacks on itself mid-flight. The rhythm of inspection lulls you. A camel kneels, salt thuds into sand, stylus scratches against a tablet, a sigh escapes someone's lips. Repeat. Over and over. Bureaucracy as hypnosis. You feel your eyelids droop in sympathy with the camel's long lashes, yet tucked in the monotony are hints of tension. Traders whisper about inspectors feared more than bandits, because at least bandits might take pity and leave you your water. An official tax collector, on the other hand, will stand calmly in the sun until you hand over every coin, every crumb. Some records even show guards stationed to enforce compliance, spears catching the light like bureaucratic exclamation points. You drift into a daydream, a desert courtroom, with a camel on trial for underpaying tolls. The scribe presides as judge, the inspector prosecutes, and the poor beast moans in defense. Joke 3. Verdict delivered, guilty of excessive cud chewing. Historians still argue whether such elaborate checkpoints existed at fixed sites or were mobile, shifting with caravan routes. Some ruins suggest permanent customs houses, others just piles of ostraca dropped like breadcrumbs. The sand keeps its secrets, leaving us to imagine inspectors trudging after the caravans like desert auditors who really need to work on their cardio. As the sun arcs high, the line of beasts moves on, bells clinking like sleepy wind chimes. Paperwork flutters in the heat, clay tallies bake harder, and the whole system feels absurdly eternal. You sigh, pat the nearest camel on the neck, and whisper that taxes come for everyone, even the beasts of burden. It blinks slowly, unimpressed, chewing on nothing as if to say, "Tell me something I don't know." And so you walk, lulled by the steady crunch of hooves, lost in the ridiculous poetry of camels carrying both salt and receipts across a desert that taxes even patience itself. The caravan drifts into silence again, and you find yourself trailing behind until the ruins of another settlement rise from the sand like crooked teeth. Unlike the checkpoint walls, this place whispers of thought more than trade. You step through a cracked doorway and discover something unexpected. Not sacks of grain, not salt slabs, but shelves. Or what remains of them. Wooden beams collapsed long ago, but fragments of manuscripts and papyrus still hide in clay jars and sealed niches. One mainstream fact steadies you. The Sahara wasn't all emptiness, it held libraries. The most famous, of course, bloomed later in Timbuktu with manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and law. But even smaller oases preserved texts, some of them shockingly mundane. Imagine walking into a treasure room and finding taxation manuals. Entire scrolls filled with rules about grain levies, animal tolls, and caravan fees. You almost hear a collective groan from the ages. Scholars, poets, and yes, accountants, working side by side. The quirky tidbit makes you grin. Some surviving manuscripts mix verses of poetry with bureaucratic notes, as if one scribe grew bored in the margins and thought, "If I must tally donkeys, at least I'll write a love couplet about her eyes." You picture future historians scratching their heads at a papyrus that suddenly veers from 2 baskets millet, 1 lamb into "the moon is jealous of her." Joke 1. Maybe that was the world's first passive-aggressive work doodle. Historians still argue whether these texts were meant as living administrative tools or ceremonial archives to impress rulers with their people's orderliness. Were they actively consulted, or were they more like the corporate handbooks nobody reads but everyone cites? The debate lingers like the dust motes drifting across the ruined shelves. You crouch and lift a fragment, careful as if it were glass. The ink strokes are faded but precise, a lattice of rules about exemptions for widows, scribbled in between notes on tariffs for foreign merchants. You marvel at the balance, compassion tucked beside cold numbers, as though the same mind that weighed silver also considered mercy. The soundscape of the room settles around you. A phantom cough, the faint rasp of reeds on parchment, the murmur of scholars debating ink recipes. You imagine one scribe boasting that his black ink, made from burnt date pits, lasts longer than his rivals. Another insists his brown earth pigment resists smudging better. Joke 2 slips in. Basically medieval, "my printer ink is superior" arguments, minus the IT department. The longer you linger, the more you sense the odd companionship of dreamers and bureaucrats. One manuscript contains an astrological chart calculating auspicious days for tax collection, because apparently you didn't want to demand millet when Saturn was in a bad mood. You chuckle softly. Who knew that the cosmos doubled as a tax calendar? And still, questions remain. Historians still argue whether these Saharan libraries were continuous centers of knowledge or sporadic bursts, built up in moments of prosperity and abandoned in decline. Were they linked to great trans-Saharan networks, or were they humble oases, stubbornly keeping receipts alongside poetry? The uncertainty is strangely soothing, like half-told stories that fade before the ending. The chamber cools as evening sets in. You sit cross-legged, back against a broken jar, and picture scholars copying ledgers by flickering oil lamps, pausing only to trade gossip about who miscalculated what invoice. In the hush, the line between poetry and taxes blurs. Both, after all, are ways of ordering chaos, whether with numbers or with words. You lean your head back, listening to the wind sigh through the cracks. Shelves gone, ink faded, palms swaying far outside. But for a moment you're surrounded by the gentle companionship of minds who insisted that nothing, not even bureaucracy, was too boring to preserve. And in their persistence, you find an odd calm, like a lullaby written in ledger lines. You shuffle deeper into the ruins, and the dusty silence twists into murmurs, traders' voices, scribes' sighs, officials clearing their throats with practiced menace. The subject? Not receipts neatly filed, but the little cracks in the system. Here, where ledgers grow thick and ink runs dry, loopholes sprout like weeds. You hear one merchant argue with a tax collector about cows. Not the usual tax on milk or hides. This one's invoking a peculiar exemption clause, the holy cow rule. One mainstream fact rises. Throughout North Africa and the Sahel, certain animals or objects tied to religious practice often received tax exemptions. Livestock dedicated to shrines, for example, could bypass levies. So while most herds trudge through checkpoints heavily taxed, a cow with sacred status might stroll smugly past, jingling its bells like royalty. The quirky tidbit drifts in. Some records mention traders labeling ordinary cows as holy, just to avoid fees. Imagine a caravan leader hurriedly painting a sun symbol on his cow before inspection. You laugh under your breath. Tax fraud via livestock cosplay. Joke 1. The cow's probably thinking, Namaste, tax man. Historians still argue whether officials turned a blind eye to these antics or cracked down hard. Was the holy cow loophole respected because of genuine piety, or was it a tolerated scam that let everyone save face? Evidence is frustratingly patchy. Some tablets read like firm decrees, others like winks between the lines. Beyond cows, loopholes multiply. A scribble on one ostracon suggests tax collectors were required to take breaks during the hottest part of the day. Traders naturally scheduled their arrivals for those very hours, hoping to slip past with fewer inspections. You smirk. It's the desert's version of timing your shopping for when the cashier's least attentive. Bribes hum through the air too. You picture a weary scribe accidentally miscopying numbers after a trader offers him a jar of date wine. Joke 2 floats up. The oldest accounting software error. Grease the clerk. Watch your goats disappear from the ledger. You trace faded ink that lists exemptions. Widows given grace periods. Traveling scholars exempt from levies. Caravans carrying religious texts granted safe passage. The mix is oddly human, rules bending toward compassion at times, toward corruption at others. The balance feels fragile, like a camel swaying under too much cargo. Still, the system tried to hold. Inspectors developed countermeasures, colored seals pressed into clay, secondary scribes double-checking tallies. One account even describes roaming auditors who shadowed caravans, recording alternate versions of transactions. You imagine the dread of discovering an auditor trailing your donkey like a nosy neighbor? Joke 3. Modern equivalent. Your accountant secretly following your grocery cart. Historians still argue whether these anti-bribery measures worked at scale. Did the desert bureaucracy collapse under its own loopholes, or did it somehow stagger along, functional enough to keep caravans moving? The debate feels endless, echoing in the cracked stone around you. Night gathers, stars prickling awake. You picture traders huddled by fires, whispering tricks of the trade. Which inspector loves figs? Which clerk hates long tallies? Which towns let you label your camels as holy cargo if you donate a rug to the mosque? It's gossip as survival guide, passed down like maps. You breathe deeply, the cool air thick with sand and secrets. The loopholes, the bribes, the exemptions, they blur together until they feel almost like lullabies, soft and repetitive. In the desert, even corruption has a rhythm, steady enough to rock you gently toward sleep. By late season, the light hardens, a pale blade over the dunes, and you drift toward a village whose well mouth looks bruised with worry. The bucket thuds against stone with a hollow echo. You lean in and hear only the scrape of rope. No glitter at the bottom, only a breath of air like a sigh. Around the square, ledgers sprawl open on knees and tablet tops, their neat columns fattening with arrears. Drought does that. Turns numbers brittle. Turns patience to dust. Where the palms once murmured with water, they now rattle like bones. Scribes try to keep order by inventing it. You watch one draw a new column titled Temporary Drought Accommodation, then add a sub-column titled Fee for Said Accommodation. You blink. The desert has discovered the service charge. He explains in a calm voice that postponements need maintenance, that maintenance needs revenue, and revenue needs names. It's strangely soothing. Bureaucracy humming to itself while the sky forgets how to rain. Joke 1 steals in. Apparently the Sahara invented surge pricing long before ride-hailing figured it out. A mainstream fact steadies you. When water retreats, empires wobble. The Garamantes, remember those tunnel masters with fogaras running like hidden rivers? Prospered for centuries, but their underground channels and fossil aquifers demanded constant upkeep. As the water table fell and labor stretched thin, fields shrank, and so did revenue. The kingdom's pulse slowed until it was mostly ledgers and memory. Far west and south, Sahelian towns rode cycles of abundance and hunger. Drought in medieval centuries pinched caravans, squeezed markets like Sijil Massa, Gao, and Timbuktu, and stuffed tax books with IOUs. The officials, cornered by empty domes of sky, get creative. One clerk lists a well-ring maintenance levy, a modest chip of grain or coin to repair cracked masonry. Another introduces dust mitigation, which sounds ridiculous until you watch a squall erase a storehouse roof. A third proposes animal lane rights, basically tolls for moving your herds between two dying pastures. The village murmurs, not angry yet, just tired. Dead is a camel that kneels slowly. A woman with a sunburnt scarf steps forward, clutching a wicker tray of dates as pale as moonlight. Her grove produced half its usual crop, and she owes a tenth. The scribe calculates, subtracts a small drought relief credit, then adds a public cistern share. The net is not kind, but it is less cruel than it could be. You see him glance at the red ink and choose brown instead. Mercy today is a color choice. Quirky tidbit time. The water shares here are measured by bowls. The well committee keeps a perforated bronze bowl that floats in a trough. When it fills and sinks, your turn ends. Receipts sometimes record not buckets or pitchers, but 1 bowl, 2 bowls, half a bowl, which reads like a recipe for surviving the week. You picture the bowl settling lower, then kissing the surface with a sigh. Legal time exhausted by gravity. Somewhere, like a scribe scratches half bowl taxable, and you both wince and smile. Historians still argue whether such water clocks spread to oases from the east with Qanat builders, or grew locally as a simple, beautiful fix anyone with a bowl could invent. They also argue whether drought years saw official remissions, true forgiveness, or merely rescheduling disguised as generosity. You feel the debate ripple through the square? Is this a reprieve or a pause before the bill balloons? Around the well, collateral piles up. A man lays down a copper ring, another his saddle. A third points at his best goat with the air of someone pawning a friend. The scribe records each item with a neutral pen, then draws a tiny circle for returned upon payment. Next to some circles, he writes a single word: hope. You fight the urge to clap him on the shoulder. Accounting and tenderness, sharing a stool. You step aside to let a caravaner through, his beard crusted with salt. He whispers that the northern checkpoint has added a road stabilization fee. You glance at the dune, shifting like a lazy cat, and think, sure, stabilize that. Joke 2 leans in. Charging a wine control surcharge is bold even for the desert. He lifts a small pouch and rattles it. Salt crumbs he's saved for taxes, hoping inspectors still accept them in fractions. They do, reluctantly. The crumbs are stamped and immediately plopped into a communal stew. Sampling remains the oldest perk of office. In a corner of the square, the Holy Cow Clause returns from Section 8 like a familiar camel bell. A herder insists his animals remain exempt as shrine dedicated, drought or no. The inspector nods to the priest, who nods back with the resigned air of a man whose blessings are now also audits. The compromise: the cows pass free, but the pasture path requires a token fee to maintain sacred shade. You remember donkey wear and tear and almost laugh. Everything frays in a drought, why not shadows? Historians still argue whether these improvisations, fees for lanes, bowls for shares, crumbs for tax, represent a state in control or a state unraveling. Was this nimble policy, responsive and local, or a frantic patchwork to keep the books from openly bleeding? The sand offers no footnotes. It preserves the ledgers and swallows the meetings. By noon, the square turns to brass. You retreat under a lintel where a young scribe massages his cramping hand and shows you the day's marginalia. Tiny palm trees drawn in the corners, a camel with a halo, your royal camel from Section 6 getting fan art, and a jar inked with a smile beside the phrase, Cistern Fund. Joke 3 nudges in softly. Even in austerity, the office doodles persist. Call it morale budgeting. A merchant arrives late with cracked amphorae of grain and a face that says, "Don't ask." He begs classification under loss by wind. The inspector taps the amphorae, listens, and shakes his head. Wind doesn't usually sound like teeth. Goats again. You can't help it. The memory of field nourishment, credits from Section 4, snickers in your chest. Here comes the argument. The scribe flips to a page you know too well. If your animals nibble the tax, you still owe the bite. Unless, of course, the village swears it was a public goat performing a public service. A dozen neighbors suddenly remember seeing that goat everywhere. As afternoon leans into evening, the debt list settles like silt. Some names get small stars for timely payment, little constellations of competence. Others accumulate red ticks that look like bird tracks, the language of hunger. The most fragile cases, widows, orphans, a caravaner with a cracked foot, are wrapped in a separate folio titled "Held Open." You like the phrase. It feels like a door someone refuses to close. A mainstream fact circles back with the wind. When the Atlantic trade flared along the coast, some inland routes thinned. The long trans-Saharan lifelines frayed not only from drought but from new horizons. Towns that once taxed riverine caravans now watched wealth detour towards surf. The ledgers reflect the bruise. Taxes on salt spike in one decade, on dates the next, on passage the next, as if officials were chasing the revenue with a net full of holes. Night climbs. The well committee locks the bowl in a coffer. The sound is soft, apologetic, and nails a notice to the date press wall. 2 bowls at dawn for communal gardens. Private shares resume at sunrise, plus 1 prayer. The phrasing is kind and precise, music set to measure. You realize you've come to love their sentences the way you love the steady clink of a camel's bell. Practical, rhythmic, faintly comic in their attempt to square the sky. As stars level themselves over the square, you stretch, and the paper in your imagination rustles like palm fronds. Debt still paces the edges, patient as a jackal, but no one runs. They schedule, they stamp, they pass a jug of thin syrup and laugh at the inspector's sandals. Humor, it turns out, is tax-exempt. You close your eyes and feel the day's entries slide into a sleepy blur. Half bowls and dust fees, sacred shade and crumb stamps, mercy written in brown ink. The drought has tightened everything, but the ledger, stubborn, stays open. Pages fluttering like small wings, keeping time until the well remembers the taste of water. The night sky fades into lavender and you trudge along an old caravan road, where stones crunch beneath your sandals like broken pottery. Ahead, the ruins shift in style. Arches higher, bricks cleaner, inscriptions and alphabets not native to the desert. You've stumbled into a mashup, a place where foreign empires left their fingerprints all over the local bureaucracy. The air here hums with overlapping rules like 2 songs played at once, slightly out of key. One mainstream fact anchors you. The Romans, reaching down from North Africa's Mediterranean fringe, left behind customs posts and tariff systems that brushed into the desert. Later, Byzantine and Arab administrators layered their own systems atop local Berber practices. Taxes multiplied, not always consistently, and towns became experiment zones where you might pay in salt at one counter, then in coin at the next. It's basically the Sahara's version of juggling 3 different phone chargers and realizing none quite fit. The quirky tidbit draws a grin. In some fragments from Egypt's western oases, scribes used Greek script to write down Berber names, then added Arabic notations centuries later. The result? Tax forms that look like chaotic shopping lists written by a multilingual toddler. Joke 1 drifts in. Historians squint at them today like you squint at receipts where half's in English, half's in metric, and none of it matches your bank app. Historians still argue whether these colonial overlays truly standardized the desert economy or just confused everyone. Some scholars insist Roman and Islamic tax codes created stability that allowed caravans to flourish. Others counter that locals mostly ignored the paperwork, paying bribes or inventing their own parallel ledgers to keep sanity. The evidence is scattered. Ostraca, papyrus, coins, seals, all whispering, none agreeing. You wander past a stone slab inscribed with Latin tariff terms, a fee on pack animals, a percentage on traded goods. Just beside it, scratched later in Arabic, is a note exempting religious travelers. You imagine two inspectors from different centuries arguing at the same checkpoint, each insisting their system still applies. Joke 2 writes itself. You picture the poor merchant stuck between them, groaning, "Can't you two just merge like phone companies?" Coins glitter faintly in the sand, some Roman bronzes, others Islamic dinars. Archaeologists still dig them up, puzzled at how both appear in the same layers. Did the locals flip between them depending on who marched through town? Probably. Currency is stubborn, but survival is more so. As you stroll, you notice a crumbled customs house. Its walls show faint murals. One panel of soldiers collecting tribute, another of camels parading into an arch, and a third, barely visible, of scribes hunched over tables. You shake your head. No matter the empire, the most consistent image is always somebody with ink-stained fingers, tallying what belongs to whom. Inside, ghost scribes mutter in multiple tongues. A Greek clerk complains about barley taxes. An Arab scribe insists on zakat calculations. A Berber elder shrugs and says, "We've always done it my way." The conversation loops like a bad podcast. Historians still argue whether this cacophony harmonized into hybrid systems or dissolved into chaos. The desert, silent, refuses to clarify. A camel bell tinkles outside, breaking the tension. You imagine traders juggling scrolls like passports, flipping between languages as inspectors demand proof. Humor lingers when you picture a donkey being issued 3 tax tags at once. One Latin, one Arabic, one in symbols only the locals recognize. Joke 3. It's the medieval version of carrying too many loyalty cards in your wallet. The desert swallows the ruins in quiet dignity. Still, the traces of colonial mashups remain. Slabs of salt taxed one way, coins stamped another, receipts scribbled in overlapping alphabets. You sigh, realizing how familiar it feels. Today's paperwork still suffers from too many systems, too many forms, too many official ways to say the same thing. And yet, through all this chaos, the caravans kept walking, and the ledgers kept filling, proof that humans will always find a way to keep trading, even if it means hauling 3 different tax forms through the sand. You leave the colonial inscriptions behind and drift into a quieter corner of the ruins, where the air feels less official and more conspiratorial. A circle of low stools surrounds a cracked table, and though the people are long gone, you can almost hear them still. Scribes, off-duty at last, whispering, teasing, gossiping about the strangest things. Pen nibs, ink batches, and who messed up which ledger. One mainstream fact drifts into your thoughts. Scribes weren't just faceless drones. Across the Sahara and its oases, they were respected professionals, sometimes trained in schools or mosque libraries, sometimes apprenticed under fathers or uncles. Their reputations carried weight, and a sloppy hand could ruin trust as surely as a bad tax rate. But respect doesn't stop gossip. You imagine them rolling their eyes at a colleague's crooked columns, chuckling over someone who accidentally recorded 42 donkeys instead of 4. And then the quirky tidbit makes you smile. In some manuscripts from Timbuktu and Fezzan, you find doodles in the margins. Fish, birds, even what looks suspiciously like a caricature of a camel inspector with ears too big. Joke 1 floats up. Even in medieval tax offices, doodling your boss was apparently universal. Historians still argue whether these casual touches mean scribes enjoyed a relaxed culture or whether they were pushing boundaries in secret. Were the doodles tolerated, or were they tiny rebellions, smuggled into the paperwork like hidden jokes? Nobody knows, and the uncertainty adds to the charm. The phantom conversation around you grows clearer. One scribe brags about a new batch of ink, claiming it came from soot scraped off a sacred lamp. Which surely makes my receipts holier. Another shakes his head, insisting river mud ink flows smoother. They laugh, each secretly convinced they're right. You almost expect them to start rating each other's handwriting like students rating professors online. A louder voice cuts in, someone mocking a colleague for a mistake. Did you hear Ahmed wrote camel dung instead of camel load? Whole caravan laughed for a week. You grin. Bureaucracy may be dull, but bureaucratic blunders? Eternal comedy. Joke 2. Imagine that entry surviving for centuries, archaeologists mistaking it for proof of a dung tax. Beyond ink and errors, the gossip stretches to families and favors. You overhear whispers about which official always demands figs as bribes, which trader sings to distract the inspectors, which widow's basket was quietly marked paid when everyone knew she hadn't. The ledgers tell one story, the scribes gossip another. Historians still argue whether these scribal communities were centralized, tied to courts and state treasuries, or scattered, half-independent, scribbling for whoever paid. Were they proud professionals or just literate freelancers? The debate echoes in the imaginary laughter that still bounces around this ruined room. The night air presses in and the gossip fades to softer tones. Stories of who courted whom, whose child could already copy numbers, who once fell asleep on the job and woke with ink all over his face. Joke 3. One scribe apparently snored so loud he left accidental zigzags on a papyrus, which another clerk later misread as tax symbols. You lean back, smiling, lulled by the hum of centuries-old chatter. Even in the desert's silence, the scribes' voices linger. Not lofty proclamations or royal decrees, but the small human murmur of colleagues teasing, boasting, and comparing whose ink stains washed out worst. And somehow, that gossip feels warmer than any king's edict. And then the quirky tidbit makes you smile. In some manuscripts from Timbuktu and Fezzan, you find doodles in the margins. Fish, birds, even what looks suspiciously like a caricature of a camel inspector with ears too big. Joke 1 floats up. Even in medieval tax offices, doodling your boss was apparently universal. Historians still argue whether these casual touches mean scribes enjoyed a relaxed culture or whether they were pushing boundaries in secret. Were the doodles tolerated, or were they tiny rebellions, smuggled into the paperwork like hidden jokes? Nobody knows, and the uncertainty adds to the charm. The phantom conversation around you grows clearer. One scribe brags about a new batch of ink, claiming it came from soot scraped off a sacred lamp. Which surely makes my receipts holier. Another shakes his head, insisting river mud ink flows smoother. They laugh, each secretly convinced they're right. You almost expect them to start rating each other's handwriting like students rating professors online. A louder voice cuts in, someone mocking a colleague for a mistake. Did you hear Ahmed wrote camel dung instead of camel load? Whole caravan laughed for a week. You grin. Bureaucracy may be dull, but bureaucratic blunders? Eternal comedy. Joke 2. Imagine that entry surviving for centuries, archaeologists mistaking it for proof of a dung tax. Beyond ink and errors, the gossip stretches to families and favors. You overhear whispers about which official always demands figs as bribes, which trader sings to distract the inspectors, which widow's basket was quietly marked paid when everyone knew she hadn't. The ledgers tell one story, the scribes gossip another. Historians still argue whether these scribal communities were centralized, tied to courts and state treasuries, or scattered, half-independent, scribbling for whoever paid. Were they proud professionals or just literate freelancers? The debate echoes in the imaginary laughter that still bounces around this ruined room. The night air presses in and the gossip fades to softer tones. Stories of who courted whom, whose child could already copy numbers, who once fell asleep on the job and woke with ink all over his face. Joke 3. One scribe apparently snored so loud he left accidental zigzags on a papyrus, which another clerk later misread as tax symbols. You lean back, smiling, lulled by the hum of centuries-old chatter. Even in the desert's silence, the scribes' voices linger. Not lofty proclamations or royal decrees, but the small human murmur of colleagues teasing, boasting, and comparing whose ink stains washed out worst. And somehow, that gossip feels warmer than any king's edict. You wander away from the scribe gossip, the laughter still ghosting your ears until your foot strikes something hard beneath the sand. You crouch, brush gently, and a round gleam winks back at you. A coin, another, then another. Soon your hands sift through a shallow scatter of dusty dinars and bronzes, relics from pockets that emptied centuries ago. One mainstream fact shines clear. Archaeologists have uncovered caches of Islamic dinars, Roman bronzes, and West African cowrie shells in Saharan towns like Gao and Tadmeka. Coins carried more than value, they carried propaganda, kings stamping their names and caliphs inscribing verses of faith. To stumble across them is to hear rulers shouting across dunes, "Remember me, pay in my name." The quirky tidbit: some of these coins bear corrections. A few were struck so sloppily that later scribes had to annotate ledgers explaining which misprinted batch still counted as legal tender. You chuckle, imagining a weary merchant squinting at a coin that reads like a typo and asking, "So, do I still owe tax on this?" Joke 1. Counterfeit or just bad spell check on bronze? Historians still argue whether coins were the dominant medium in the desert, or merely a supplement to barter and salt slabs. Some insist gold dinars fueled the caravan economy, linking the Sahara to the wider Islamic world. Others argue that in daily life, salt and grain still mattered more, with coins reserved for long-distance or ceremonial exchanges. The scattered hoards don't settle the debate, they only make it glitter. You pick up one coin, edges smoothed by fingers, its script still legible, a caliph's name beside a prayer. Another coin bears the faint outline of a Roman emperor, gaze chipped but defiant. Strange bedfellows in the same sand. You imagine a merchant jingling a pouch with both, shrugging at the absurdity of mixing centuries in a single payment. Around you, the desert fills with the phantom clink of currency. Traders kneel by fires, pouring coins onto mats, inspecting edges, muttering about exchange rates. One laughs about a caravan fined for late delivery. Penalty noted in coin, with interest tallied until the debt doubled. Joke 2. Apparently late fees are as immortal as camels. A scribe carefully records denominations. His ledger shows columns for salt, grain, and coin, all convertible at set rates. But when he tries to balance the numbers, you see his shoulders sag. Inflation, even in the desert, was a shadow hard to chase. Some records show a slab of salt worth 1 dinar, then 3, then 5. Historians still argue whether this was genuine economic fluctuation or creative math to justify tax hikes. Nearby, you hear gossip about buried stashes. Merchants, fearing raids, supposedly hid purses beneath date palms or in walls of houses. Centuries later, those stashes are exactly what archaeologists find: forgotten savings that never made it back into circulation. You picture the poor merchant, long gone, still worrying from beyond the grave whether his taxes are overdue. Joke 3 sneaks in. Somewhere a spectral tax collector is still trying to issue him a fine. You let the coins trickle through your fingers, cool against your palm. Each carries weight beyond its metal: promises, penalties, propaganda. They are receipts fossilized, payment frozen mid-transaction. And as you lie back on the sand, stars glinting like scattered dinars overhead, you realize the desert itself is the safest vault of all, burying both treasure and debt under dunes that no inspector dares audit. You leave the glitter of coins behind and step into a hush so deep it feels heavier than the sand. Around you rise half walls and door frames, toppled roofs yawning at the stars. The silence is misleading, though, because buried here are ledgers, whole libraries of them, that chart the decline of cities in neat, exhausted handwriting. Collapse doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in tidy columns of numbers that don't add up anymore. One mainstream fact steadies your step. When trans-Saharan trade routes shifted, nudged by coastal commerce, climate change, or political upheaval, cities that once thrived shrank and vanished. The Garamantes declined with their Fagaras, Sijil Massa dimmed after attacks and changing routes, and even Timbuktu felt the weight of shifting trade toward the Atlantic. Taxes stopped feeding the cities, and the ledgers show it. Revenues dip, unpaid debts balloon, margins groan with red ink. The quirky tidbit? Some late records list fees so absurd they sound like satire. Taxes on wind-fallen dates, penalties for unattended donkeys, levies for shade enjoyed at communal walls. You smirk at the desperation, picturing officials inventing charges while their wells dried. Joke one slips in, you half expect to see oxygen levy scratch somewhere. Pay up for every breath. Historians still argue whether these collapsing ledgers reflect real policy or scribes improvising to stay on the payroll. Were rulers still trying to govern with impossible taxes, or were clerks padding the books to preserve appearances? The fragments don't say. They only whisper through cracked ink, the panic of order unraveling. You crouch beside a half-buried tablet. The numbers climb for years, then flatline. Grain tallies shrink, salt shipments stop, livestock vanish column by column. It's strangely intimate, like watching a heartbeat falter on paper. Collapse, written down without fanfare, just subtraction. You imagine the final days, a scribe hunched in an empty office, pen nib split, recording debts he knows no one will ever pay. Outside, caravans bypass the gates, following newer roads. Inside, he scratches arrears continue like a mantra. Joke too. Somewhere in his exhaustion, he probably thought, if no one pays me, do I owe myself taxes? Archaeologists have found abandoned storerooms still stacked with clay seals, unused and unbroken. Officials must have ordered new batches long after trade stopped. An echo of faith that caravans would return. They never did. The seals, never pressed, became fossils of optimism. Historians still argue whether such stockpiles prove denial at the top or loyalty below, clerks keeping faith even as cities hollowed. You walk through empty streets, the ghost of bureaucracy brushing your sleeve. Ledgers flapping in the wind, unfinished tallies, scribes gone but their ink still stubborn. Collapse is oddly neat in the desert. Walls crumble, wells crack, roofs fall, but the paperwork endures as though refusing to admit the city is gone. Joke 3 curls in softly. It's like the ruins are waiting for someone to pay overdue taxes before they'll finally disintegrate. You almost whisper an apology to the stones for showing up without a receipt. The night deepens. Stars blink above, patient and indifferent. Around you, the collapsed cities rest with their tax forms intact, proof that even endings can be documented. You breathe slow, lulled by the paradox. Destruction tallied neatly, ruin wrapped in receipts, silence stamped with seals that will never be broken. Morning thins the stars, and you wander from the ledgers of collapse into towns that still breathe. Busy, sun-struck places strung along the desert's edges. Asphalt glitters like a mirage. Motorbikes hum where camels used to grumble. And yet, as you drift past a market stall stacked with date bricks and plastic jerry cans, you feel a familiar tug. The paperwork here doesn't seem new. It's the same melody played on different instruments. You queue at a municipal counter under a ceiling fan that clicks like a lazy metronome. A clerk slides open a drawer and produces a rubber stamp large enough to brand a buffalo. One form asks for a freight fee on bulk commodities. Your eyes skim the list: salt, grain, animal feed, and you blink. Didn't you just trudge 100 miles across centuries to get away from this? The clerk smiles the way desert clerks have always smiled and thumps the stamp, a neat violet circle spreading like an oasis on paper. The numbers are decimal now, the ink synthetic, but the cadence is ancient. Presentation, measure, levy, receipt. A mainstream fact tucks itself into your pocket. The old salt road didn't vanish the moment trucks appeared. In parts of the Sahara, caravans still plodded from Taoudani toward Timbuktu well into the late 20th century, and sometimes you can still catch a string of camels cutting the skyline. Ceremonial, practical, stubborn. Tax posts that once counted hooves now count axles, but the principle hasn't budged. Wealth moves, the state tags along with a pen. You turn down a lane of sheet metal shops. A boy weighs rebar on a creaking scale while a woman totals a purchase on her phone, then double enters figures in a notebook. A two-ledger dance that would make any Garamontes scribe nod in approval. When she hands you a receipt, you can't help smiling. It's stamped for market sanitation and road maintenance. The same spirit that once justified well ring upkeep in that drowdy square. The vocabulary changed. The urge to keep paths open did not. You imagine inspectors from Section 6 squinting at a modern axle toll and thinking, reasonable. Your humor returns when a driver rolls past with a sticker on his windshield that reads, loosely, bless this trip. You picture ancient traders tucking amulets into saddlecloths to charm the inspectors. Joke 1. The new talisman is laminated. Progress. In a storefront of shade, a tax officer explains a seasonal surcharge for vendors who borrow the street during festivals. You hear the echo of sacred shade fees from Section 9 and fail to smother a grin. Historians still argue whether these municipal charges are direct descendants of pre-colonial dues, those palm shadow levies and thoroughfare tolls, or improvisations born from colonial bylaws and modern budgets. Continuity or reinvention? The line between them ripples like heat over asphalt. At the bus park, you watch a porter negotiate a loading bay ticket. Once upon a dune, that was a gate pass for camels. Now it's a printed chit with a QR code that refuses to scan until someone wipes dust off the screen with the corner of a scarf. The officer shrugs, inspects with the same narrowed eyes you've seen for 1,000 years, then waves the truck through. Joke 2 sighs onto the breeze. The code has sand in it. Truly a Sahara problem. Around the corner, a date seller arranges his crop in woven trays. He tells anyone who'll listen, your imagination translates, that the cooperative keeps the scales honest. You skim the posted rates, there's a percentage for the market authority, a small cut for trash collection, and a donation box for the mosque school. A few lines down, a curious item. Taste allowance, strictly limited. You chuckle, remembering those salt inspectors who sampled crumbs for quality control. The desert invented QC snacking, apparently, and it survives under a polite label. A quirky tidbit flutters onto your palm in the form of a fee schedule printed on glossy card. In one column, alongside water bills and stall rent, is a charge simply called file opening. It's not much, but you feel the universe wink. The Oasis scribes once billed for copying. The 21st century bills for folders. You picture our old reed pen friend under the palm smirking. See, my ink fee had grandchildren. Historians still argue whether the informal tea fees that everyone knows about but nobody names are systemic corruption or the social oil that keeps gears from grinding in places where official salaries lag behind reality. Are these the modern cousins of jars of date wine passed under benches? Those winked-at adjustments that made ancient ledgers breathe? Or are they something new, born of cramped budgets and wide horizons? The debate hums beneath the fan. You drift toward a border crossing, a low-slung building where the desert crowds into a single doorway. Trucks line up, tarps flapping like sails. On the far wall, signs bloom in 3 languages. You remember the polyglot forms of Section 10? and feel the same headache bloom behind your eyes. A guard checks manifests and waves a handheld scale over cargo. Another reviews a binder thicker than a camel's ankle full of exemptions. Medical supplies, textbooks, relief grain. There, too, is the echo. Widows and scholars once earned grace in ledgers. Today, ambulances and school kits skim the line with stamped blessings. Someone argues about classification, whether groundnut paste is a spread or an oil product. You flash back to the goat-dropping debate. Do not tax the goat, do tax what it leaves behind, and stifle a laugh. Joke 3. If peanut butter were ancient, some scribe would have created a column titled, Suspiciously Delicious, Taxable per Spoon. The road west unfurls, edged by power poles and, in stretches, by dunes that look ready to trespass. You pass a municipal sign promising drift sand mitigation, a modern cousin to road stabilization from the drought years. Budget lines still chase the wind with admirable optimism. The project office smells of photocopier heat and sweet mint tea. A planner taps a spreadsheet while a map on the wall bristles with colored pins where the road keeps vanishing. The pins cluster like the red ticks of arrears back in those failing cities. A different anxiety, same choreography. A mainstream fact brushes your shoulder. Manuscript libraries in places like Timbuktu didn't disappear with the caravans. Families and conservation groups have kept thousands of texts safe, smuggled them in footlockers when trouble came, digitized pages by lamplight. Among the poetry and law and astronomy, the bureaucratic heartbeat endures. Contracts for trade, endowments for wells, tax notes so specific you can feel the reed scratch. The archive glows like a coal in the ash, proof that the paperwork of ordinary life carries dignity enough to save. Even the water bowl finds its echo. In a town up the road, the schedule for the communal tap is posted by the hour, and someone's child has drawn little circles that look suspiciously like perforated bowls. The symbolism refuses to retire. 2 hours for the neighborhood garden, then households, then the mosque's cistern. Precise, kind, and only a little bossy. You can hear the bowl kiss the surface again. As afternoon leans long, you sit on a concrete stoop and watch receipts rustle like small wings. Motorbikes flit, vendors call, phones chirp, and somewhere a printer coughs out another stack of chits. The modern city hums, but the pattern underneath is old as shade. Measure, share, repair, repeat. You let that rhythm settle into your breathing. You think of the colonial mashups, the holy cows, the auditors skulking behind caravans, the salt crumbs stamped and savored. The forms change, the fonts get fancier, the stamp pads turn violet instead of soot black, but the conversation between survival and fairness keeps going, line after careful line. Historians still argue whether that conversation has trended kinder or merely more complicated. Maybe both. Maybe kindness hides in the complications, like mercy written in brown ink when red would do. Evening softens the edges. A street sweeper lifts the day's dust as lightly as a clerk turns a page. Somewhere, a municipal loudspeaker thanks taxpayers in 3 languages and reminds everyone to bring exact change. You smile, stand, and let your feet carry you back toward the open dunes where the oldest filing cabinet on Earth. The sand itself waits to take the day's stories and slide them gently into its endless whispering drawers. You drift toward a border crossing, a low-slung building where the desert crowds into a single doorway. Trucks line up, tarps flapping like sails. On the far wall, signs bloom in 3 languages. You remember the polyglot forms of Section 10 and feel the same headache bloom behind your eyes. A guard checks manifests and waves a handheld scale over cargo. Another reviews a binder thicker than a camel's ankle full of exemptions. Medical supplies, textbooks, relief grain. There, too, is the echo. Widows and scholars once earned grace in ledgers. Today, ambulances and school kits skim the line with stamped blessings. Someone argues about classification, whether groundnut paste is a spread or an oil product. You flash back to the goat dropping debate. Do not tax the goat, do tax what it leaves behind, and stifle a laugh. Joke 3. If peanut butter were ancient, some scribe would have created a column titled Suspiciously Delicious, Taxable per Spoon. The road west unfurls, edged by power poles and, in stretches, by dunes that look ready to trespass. You pass a municipal sign promising drift sand mitigation, a modern cousin to road stabilization from the drought years. Budget lines still chase the wind with admirable optimism. The project office smells of photocopier heat and sweet mint tea. A planner taps a spreadsheet while a map on the wall bristles with colored pins where the road keeps vanishing. The pins cluster like the red ticks of arrears back in those failing cities. A different anxiety, same choreography. A mainstream fact brushes your shoulder. Manuscript libraries in places like Timbuktu didn't disappear with the caravans. Families and conservation groups have kept thousands of texts safe, smuggled them in footlockers when trouble came, digitized pages by lamplight. Among the poetry and law and astronomy, the bureaucratic heartbeat endures. Contracts for trade, endowments for wells, tax notes so specific you can feel the reed scratch. The archive glows like a coal in the ash, proof that the paperwork of ordinary life carries dignity enough to save. Even the water bowl finds its echo. In a town up the road, the schedule for the communal tap is posted by the hour, and someone's child has drawn little circles that look suspiciously like perforated bowls. The symbolism refuses to retire. 2 hours for the neighborhood garden, then households, then the mosque's cistern. Precise, kind, and only a little bossy. You can hear the bowl kiss the surface again. As afternoon leans long, you sit on a concrete stoop and watch receipts rustle like small wings. Motorbikes flit, vendors call, phones chirp, and somewhere a printer coughs out another stack of chits. The modern city hums, but the pattern underneath is old as shade. Measure, share, repair, repeat. You let that rhythm settle into your breathing. You think of the colonial mashups, the holy cows, the auditors skulking behind caravans, the salt crumbs stamped and savored. The forms change, the fonts get fancier, the stamp pads turn violet instead of soot black, but the conversation between survival and fairness keeps going, line after careful line. Historians still argue whether that conversation has trended kinder or merely more complicated. Maybe both. Maybe kindness hides in the complications, like mercy written in brown ink when red would do. Evening softens the edges. A street sweeper lifts the day's dust as lightly as a clerk turns a page. Somewhere, a municipal loudspeaker thanks taxpayers in 3 languages and reminds everyone to bring exact change. You smile, stand, and let your feet carry you back toward the open dunes where the oldest filing cabinet on Earth. The sand itself waits to take the day's stories and slide them gently into its endless whispering drawers. Historians still argue whether the silence that follows these lost cities is permanent or cyclical. Was collapse final? Dunes swallowing memory forever? Or were some ruins just pauses waiting for trade to return? Some towns flickered back to life centuries later. Others never rose again. The debate feels as endless as the horizon. You settle onto a dune. The sand sighs under your weight, flowing like liquid. Around you, the ghost of receipts drifts. Papyrus curls, clay shards, ink scratches, floating in memory. And yet the silence is kind, not cruel. The ledgers are gone, but the desert keeps their rhythm. A lullaby of tally marks dissolving into grains. Joke 2 flickers in. You wonder if the last tax collector left an IOU in the sand, hoping the wind might sign it. You lean back, letting your body sink. The stars swell overhead, glinting like forgotten coins from Section 12, spread in perfect columns across a black ledger sky. For a moment, you imagine the constellations themselves are receipts. Orion, taxable by 3 stars. The Milky Way surely overdue. Joke 3 hums. If the universe had an inspector, it would charge you for every wish made on a shooting star. But there's no inspector now, no scribe muttering in the margins. Only the hum of the wind, the slow, endless accounting of sand slipping from dune to dune. The desert has closed the books, and now, as the night stretches softer and the dunes curl around you like blankets, you can feel the story loosening its grip. The ledgers, the receipts, the endless counting. Each page turns slower, each column fades gentler, until the numbers blur into hush. The desert doesn't hurry, it never has. It lets the cities rise, tally their wealth, argue over crumbs of salt, and then quietly fold them back into silence. Breathe with that rhythm now, slow in, slower out. Imagine each breath a dune settling, each exhale a receipt fluttering to rest. The merchants have gone quiet, their salt slabs long dissolved. The camels sleep, no bells jingling, no inspectors pacing. Even the scribes have set down their pens, the ink drying one last time. Above you the stars scatter like gentle coins, but no one tallies them anymore. Their light falls freely, no tax, no tariff, just gift after gift. The desert accepts them wordlessly, filing their glow into the horizon's wide cabinet. You are safe here, in the quietest archive of all. Safe among stones that once echoed with chatter. Safe beneath skies that hold every forgotten name. Nothing is owed. Nothing is overdue. Even the wind asks for nothing but to carry you deeper into calm. So let the dunes soften beneath you. Let the ledgers close, their numbers drifting into dreams. Let the silence of lost cities cradle you, slow and steady, until sleep folds over like a final page. And when you wake again, the story will still be here, inked in sand, tallied in stars, waiting patiently for you to turn another line.